All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about America and Central Asia and the South Caucasus and how this ties into America's geopolitical policy/strategy. The United States has very deep ties with Azerbaijan. And the reason for this is because Azerbaijan lies right on the Caspian Sea, and it is across Central Asia. And so if you look at a map, you'll see Azerbaijan, the Caspian Sea, and then on the other side of the Caspian Sea, you will see Central Asia. You will see Kazakhstan. And so Azerbaijan is geopolitically extremely important to the United States because Azerbaijan is essentially the main transit point by which to transport Caspian Sea oil into Turkey and into the rest of Europe from there. The architect of the Cold War, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said that Azerbaijan is the cork for the bottle of riches that the Caspian Sea basin holds. And Central Asia is filled with oil, and it's filled with natural gas, and it is filled with uranium. In fact, Kazakhstan is the world's largest producer of uranium. The United States needs to control Azerbaijan. And if it does not control Azerbaijan, then the Russians will sweep in and control Azerbaijan. And the Russians would have control over that transit point for the moving of Caspian Sea oil. And it doesn't really matter if Azerbaijan does horrendous war crimes. It doesn't really matter what Azerbaijan does. The United States needs Azerbaijan. That's just the bottom line. A lot of this goes back to what is known as the Great Game. Back in the early 20th century, the British Empire and the Russians were in this huge rivalry over who was going to control the Caspian Sea. That rivalry over the Caspian Sea, over Central Asia, was done between the Russians and the British. And this rivalry continues on. It continues on today in this rivalry, in this very violent struggle between the United States and Russia. So basically, the rivalry between the British and the Russians over Central Asia, over Eurasia, really, continues on through Britain's daughter, America. And so now we see the Russians and the Americans doing the same rivalry that the Russians and the British had over Eurasia. And so this whole thing just continues on. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union died in the early 1990s, the Americans were eyeing Azerbaijan and they were eyeing Central Asia because they wanted their hands on the oil. But not just that, they wanted to transport oil while at the same time bypassing the Russians. Because if you look at a map, you'll see the Caspian Sea, you'll see Azerbaijan on one side, and on the other side, you'll see Central Asia. Well, on top of Azerbaijan is Russia. When you are transporting oil from Central Asia through the Caspian Sea, do you want, as America, as the United States, being an enemy of Russia, do you want to transport oil and natural gas through Russia? No, you want to isolate the Russians. This is the whole goal. You want to isolate the Russians to remove any sort of commercial leverage that the Russians may have. You want to transport the resources through Azerbaijan, because if you transport the resources, oil, natural gas, through Azerbaijan, then all you have to do is move it through Armenia and then into Nakhchivan, which is really a continuation of Azerbaijan. And then from there, you just go right into Turkey, which is a major NATO member. And then from Turkey, you can transport the resources directly into the rest of Europe, into the Balkans, and then ultimately into Central Europe, Austria, Germany. And you don't have to go through Russia, thereby weakening the Russians' geopolitical leverage. This whole reality of having to move resources through countries gives those countries leverage. They can say, well, you're transporting this oil through our country, we're going to charge you a transit fee. This is what the Ukrainians and the Poles were doing to the Russians for years. The Russians would transport their natural gas into the rest of Europe, into Central Europe, into Germany, and the Russians would have to go through Ukraine. They would have to go through Poland. And Poland would say, okay, Russia, well, you got to give us money. You got to give us transit fees. By the Russians having to go through these countries, Ukraine and Poland, it gave Ukraine and Poland geopolitical significance. So if the Europeans have to go through Russia to import Central Asian natural gas, oil, etc., that gives the Russians a degree of power. And this is a degree of power that the Americans want to deprive the Russians of. So how do you do that? You go through Azerbaijan. And this was the entire point behind the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It was so that Russia could directly transport natural gas to Germany without having to go through Ukraine or Poland. And this is the reason why NATO destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to force the Russians from having a direct transport route to Germany for its natural gas. The whole point of destroying the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was to weaken and further isolate the Russians. This was the entire purpose. And so once the Soviet Union died, the Americans and the British and all these big British, big oil companies, they were eyeing Azerbaijan and they were eyeing Central Asia. They wanted to deprive the Russians of any sort of geopolitical leverage. So in 1992, the Americans sent James Baker to Azerbaijan. James Baker was the Secretary of State under President H.W. Bush. And they sent Baker to Azerbaijan in order to normalize relations with the Azeris. Well, at this time, the Azeris were in the middle of a war with Armenia over the Armenian enclave known as Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. This territorial struggle over Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh goes back to the 1920s, specifically 1921, when Stalin and the Turks drew out Azerbaijan's borders. And when they did that, they made Artsakh, or they designated Artsakh as a part of Azerbaijan, thus leaving the Armenian enclave surrounded by the Azeri Turks. This was detrimental and really horrifying, to say the least, for the Armenians in Artsakh, because that meant they were just surrounded by enemies, by Azerbaijan. And eventually a war broke out. And this war eventually ended in 1994, and it was a very bloody war in which 30,000 people were killed. Imagine that, 30,000 people were slaughtered in this war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in the middle of this war, in 1992, there's James Baker in Azerbaijan, and he's there to normalize relations with the Azeris. Now, why was he there to normalize relations? Well, the Americans would say things like, well, you know, we really want to work with countries who agree with our values, and we don't want the evil Russians to be there because the Russians are evil. Why are the Russians evil? Because they're evil. Well, I mean, communism has fallen, and the Soviet Union is dead, so why in the hell are we worried about the Russians if the entire time the Russians were the enemy because they were communists? Well, they're communists no more, so why are we worried about the Russians? Well, because they're just evil. I mean, they're just Russians. They're barbarian orcs, hordes from the north. They have to be put down. They're mongoloid, evil, bloodthirsty monsters, cave dwellers from the east. We can't have them anywhere. The Americans said we have to work with the Azeris to keep the Russians out. But the thing is that at this time, the Azeris were responsible for horrendous war crimes and atrocities against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azeris were literally doing mass deportations of Armenians. They were ethnically cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh. That was their goal. They did not fulfill this goal until 2023. In the early 90s, they were already carrying out this act of mass deportation with the goal of just ethnically cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh of ethnic Armenians. And so the Americans were told, hey, listen, Azerbaijan is doing war crimes. They're doing atrocities. They're doing mass deportations. They're beating Armenians up because they just hate Armenians. So what say you, America? Why are you... I mean, if your whole goal is to fight against tyranny, and if the whole goal of struggling against Russia is to stop despotism, then why are you collaborating with a country that is doing war crimes, that is doing mass deportations of Christian Armenians? And the Americans said, well, because we're facing Iran. This is what they said. In 1992, they said this. We're facing Iran, we're facing Russia. So if Azerbaijan can just give us a mere promise that they are going to at least begin to abide by Western values, then that is good enough for us. This is what the Americans essentially said. And what does this prove? It proves that geopolitics comes before morals and principles. And morals and principles are only used when it is advantageous for the world of public opinion, when it is advantageous for geopolitical objectives. So if it is geopolitically advantageous to bring up morals, then morals will be referenced. And if it is geopolitically advantageous to throw morals out the window and work with actual despots, to work with people who do atrocities, then we will do just that. We don't give a damn about morals and principles and all that. We just care about geopolitical power and beating our enemies. And if that means working with Azerbaijan in order to push the Russians out of the South Caucasus, in order to dominate the resources of the Caspian Sea basin, then damn it, so be it. The Israelis, well, they've been behind this whole idea for a very long time. In the 1990s, the United States started working with the Azeris, as I've already said. One of the primary reasons as to why the Americans were working with the Azeris in the 1990s was to, as I've said, weaken the Iranians. But there was a lobby that was behind this, and that lobby was the Israel lobby in the 1990s. This was the Israel lobby. So the Israel lobby has been active for a very long time, going all the way back to the 1990s, early 1990s. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States was determining the policy in the South Caucasus by which to get the Americans to embrace Azerbaijan in order to weaken Iran, because Iran and Azerbaijan are not friends. And so by taking Azerbaijan into the fold of NATO, they keep the Russians out of the South Caucasus. They control that direct trade route from Central Asia into the South Caucasus. And they weaken the Iranians, because the Iranians cannot rely fully on Azerbaijan as an access way into Europe, because Azerbaijan is an enemy. And so where does that leave the Iranians? Armenia. And so now NATO is saying, we're going to control the Armenian side of the border with Iran. There was a war, another war between the Armenians and the Azeris. The Azeris won with the help of Turkey and NATO technology, with the help of Israel. And because the Armenians lost control over Nagorno-Karabakh / Artsakh. And as a result of this, the Americans said, okay, Armenia, you lost the war, so we are going to control your border with Iran. And the Iranians have made this very clear, that this is a provocation and that they will not tolerate this. The reason why Armenia is so vital to the Iranians is very simple, because Armenia is Iran's only reliable access way by land into Georgia, and thus into the Black Sea region. Eventually, what happened in 1993? So in 1992, the Americans began to normalize relations with the Azeris. And in 1993, there was a coup. And the democratically elected president of Azerbaijan, his name was Abulfaz Elchibey, interesting name, he was overthrown. And he was replaced by a guy named Haydar Aliyev, the father of the current president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev. Now, who was backing this coup? British Petroleum and the American oil company Amoco. So the West backed this coup. It was being done for the interest of major Western oil companies, British Petroleum and Amoco. And why did the Americans and the British do this? Well, it all goes back to the Great Game, as I said, back in the early 20th century. The British and the Russians were rivaling over who was going to control Eurasia, who was going to control the Caspian Sea, Central Asia, who was going to control Eurasia. And as I said, that great game continues on in this rivalry between the Americans and the Russians. The British and the Americans took control over Azerbaijan, and they did this for the same reason why they want to control Azerbaijan right now, to keep the Russians out of the South Caucasus and to thus control that cork, to use the term of Zbigniew Brzezinski, that cork known as Azerbaijan, which contains all of the resources in this bottle that we call Central Asia. And so by controlling Azerbaijan, you control the transit point through which you can move oil and natural gas and uranium from Central Asia through the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan, and eventually into Turkey and into the rest of Europe. Azerbaijan can do the most horrendous atrocities. Turkey can do the most horrendous atrocities. Doesn't really matter. Azerbaijan literally moved an entire population in 2023. I mean, moved out an entire population, moved all the Armenians, ethnically cleansed all the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh / Artsakh. And America still has deep ties with Azerbaijan. Turkey backed the ethnic cleansing of Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh, and we still have deep ties with the Turks. And right now, we are currently witnessing a genocide being done in the Middle East, in Gaza, by Israel. And we are still very, very tied with the Israelis. We are still very deep allies with the Israelis because we don't give a damn about principles and morals and human rights and genocides and massacres and ethnic cleansing and all that stuff. None of that stuff bothers us. When the Soviet Union died, there was this struggle within Washington about what to do with Russia. Do we be friendly with the Russians, or do we be enemies with the Russians? And there were people who said, nope, we have to work with Turkey. We have to push the Russians out of the South Caucasus, push them out of the Caspian Sea basin, and we have to dominate Eurasia. And there were three people in the American government in the 1990s who were really pushing for this. Their names were Bill White, Sheila Heslin, and you had Rosemary Forsyth. And so Forsyth and White and Heslin all had this goal of bypassing the Russians when it came to transporting Caspian Sea resources. They did not want natural resources coming from Central Asia to go through Russia. They wanted the natural resources, oil, natural gas, etc., to go through Baku, Tbilisi, Georgia, and eventually into Ceylon, Turkey, where it could be transported into the rest of Europe. The whole purpose was to weaken and isolate the Russians. And this is the goal of the Americans taking over the Armenian side of the border with Iran. What the Turks want to do is create a direct trade route between Turkey and Central Asia, a direct trade route that would go from Turkey through Nakhchivan, from Nakhchivan through Armenia, and then from there into Azerbaijan, and then from there into the Caspian Sea, and then from there into Central Asia. And by having this direct trade route, Europe, Germany, and other European countries can transport oil and natural gas directly from Central Asia without having to go through the Russians. The Americans are not going to abandon Turkey because of that direct trade route, but also because of the fact that Turkey controls the access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. And thus, NATO can use Turkey as a chess piece, a geopolitical chess piece, by which to hinder the Russians' access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. Who's behind this? It's the pro-Israel people. Of course, the anti-Russian sentiment of America definitely plays a humongous role, but the pro-Israel sentiment cannot be thrown away here. The pro-Israel sentiment cannot be ignored. It has to be factored in this whole quagmire of geopolitical rivalries. And so the Israelis are saying, look, we're going to weaken the Iranians through this policy of controlling the Armenian side of the border with Iran, and we're going to further isolate the Iranians. This is great. But what is America doing, and what is in turn Israel doing by doing this? They are empowering the Turks, because now Turkey is a direct trade route from Central Asia into the rest of Europe. That means Turkey cannot be ignored. That means Turkey has tremendous geopolitical leverage over the United States. That means the United States cannot ignore the demands of Turkey. And Turkey wants to create an empire. It wants to create a pan-Turkic empire, which would consist of course, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, etc., Uzbekistan, these countries. America has to support this, because by supporting that, by helping to create this Turkish empire, Russia is weakened in Central Asia, and NATO, and by extension America's ally Turkey, is empowered in that region. And as long as America has ties with Turkey, America can use Turkey as a chess piece against the Russians, also against the Chinese, because remember, China borders with Central Asia, which means that America can also use Turkey's influence against the Chinese in Central Asia, and by extension also in the Uyghur area of the Xinjiang region, which is a part of China, but is inhabited not by Han Chinese, but by ethnic Turks who are more connected to Turkey religiously and somewhat ethnically, definitely more so than the Chinese are. The Chinese have no cultural or religious connection with the Uyghurs, other than the fact that a lot of the Uyghurs are pro-Chinese, but enough of them are anti-Chinese. And so they can be used as a proxy against China. But Turkey's role cannot be ignored, and it is a major factor, because if America wants to bypass the Russians, it needs Turkey as a direct trade route from Central Asia into the rest of Europe. So Turkey is being more and more empowered. Turkey also has a rivalry with Israel in Syria. So while Israel is thinking, okay, we're weakening the Iranians by empowering the Turks, you're empowering the Turks. You're empowering Israel's biggest rival in the Middle East, and arguably the biggest threat to Israel in the Middle East. The biggest threat to Israel in the Middle East is not Iran. It's not Syria. It's not Hezbollah. It's not the Houthis. It's Turkey. Turkey is a very technologically advanced country. It is advancing more and more technologically. It is creating its own military-industrial complex. It's further developing this military-industrial complex, and it's only going to get stronger. And now that Turkey is going to be this major trade route for the Americans and the Europeans by which to transport oil and natural gas directly from Central Asia into the rest of Europe, Turkey cannot be rejected by the United States. America needs Turkey to go against the Russians in the Black Sea and in the Mediterranean and also in the Caspian. So Turkey is immensely empowered. But Israel and Turkey are rivals in Syria. They're struggling over who's going to control Syria. They're vying over who's going to control Syria. And eventually there's going to be a clash. Turkey and Israel cannot co-rule Syria, because that would be completely antithetical to both of their respective interests. Israel wants to create this buffer zone in southern Syria. It wants to keep the Turks weak. It wants to keep Syria divided. That's why it's backing the Druze. So that as long as Syria is divided, it's weak, and therefore Turkey is precluded from fully controlling it, because it's very difficult to control a violently divided country. Turkey wants a united Syria, because if Syria is harmonious and is united, it's easier to control. So they both have antithetical interests. Turkey wants to establish its pan-Turkic empire. That's why Turkey backs the Turkmen of Syria. Israel wants to bring into fruition this whole idea of Greater Israel. It has aspirations of establishing a Jewish empire, which is completely antithetical to Turkey's desires. So eventually there's going to be a clash. And when there is a clash, is the United States going to say, well, we have to now help Israel? Well, if you go against Turkey and help Israel, you just lost your major trade route, and Turkey would get warmer with the Russians and the Chinese. And so this is something that the Americans don't want to happen, obviously. Israel right now, as we all know, is becoming more and more of a pariah state. More and more historians and genocide experts have come out saying that Israel is doing genocide. And Israel is technically winning the war in Gaza. I mean, look at Gaza, right? It's almost completely destroyed. But Israel is losing the war of public opinion. In fact, Donald Trump did an interview recently in which he said just this. He said, Israel is losing the war of public opinion. And so they need to wrap this war up. This is what Donald Trump said just recently. And so if Donald Trump is saying this, obviously, I mean, this is an indication of what is happening in the general zeitgeist. The world is shifting against Israel and really shifting against the Jewish people. This is why Holocaust denialism is increasing tremendously. In fact, Donald Trump himself said this. He said Holocaust denialism is growing, and more. He said that you're having more and more Holocaust deniers. The number of Holocaust deniers is increasing tremendously. So the world is shifting against Israel. And if Israel becomes more and more of a pariah state, and if it just continues on this pathway towards destructive actions and fanaticism, I think eventually the Western world is just going to say, it's not really worth it to contain you. It's not really worth it to coddle you. And Turkey is very important to us geostrategically. We need Turkey to go against the Chinese and the Russians. We need Turkey to have leverage in the Caspian Sea and to have this direct trade route to bypass the Russians when transporting natural resources from Central Asia into Europe. We can't lose Turkey. So, you know what? Maybe we're just going to allow the Turks to be sicked on you. And if that happens, I mean, it's not really going to be surprising. And if Israel is devastated and destroyed by the Turks and the Iranians, the world is going to rejoice. It's going to be like that verse in the book of Revelation when it says that the world rejoices at Babylon's destruction. The world is going to rejoice at the destruction of Jerusalem. The world will rejoice at the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is, whether it knows it or not, Jerusalem is paving its own path towards destruction. Sure, it's trying to weaken the Iranians, but it's also empowering the Turks. Remember, Israel was one of the major contributors to the overthrowing of Bashar al-Assad, which strengthened the Turks. And now Israel is getting what it wants by having the Americans control Armenia's border with Iran. And Israel is saying, look, we're getting what we want here. Yeah, but you're strengthening the Turks' position in the Caspian Sea and in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia. You're empowering your biggest enemy. So like Judas hung on the noose, Israel will eventually hang from its own noose. Bottom line. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.